A reading from the first letter of St. Paul to the Corinthians. Brothers and sisters, strive eagerly for the greatest spiritual gifts, but I shall show you a still more excellent way. If I speak in human and angelic tongues, but do not have love, I am a resounding gong or a clashing cymbal. And if I have the gift of prophecy, and comprehend all mysteries and all knowledge, if I have all faith so as to move mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give away everything I own, and if I hand my body over so that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing. Love is patient, love is kind. It is not jealous, it is not pompous, it is not inflated, it is not rude. It does not seek its own interests. It is not quick-tempered. It does not brood over injury. It does not rejoice over wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never fails. If there are prophecies, they will be brought to nothing. If tongues, they will cease. If knowledge, it will be brought to nothing. For we know partially, and we prophesy partially. But when the perfect comes, the partial will pass away. When I was a child, I used to talk as a child, think as a child, reason as a child. When I became a man, I put aside childish things. At present, we see indistinctly, as in a mirror, but then face to face. At present, I know partially. Then I shall know fully, as I am fully known. So faith, hope, love remain, these three. But the greatest of these is love. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
And so we have reached the climax of this journey through the first letter to the Corinthians that occupies the second readings for the first couple of months of ordinary time. And especially those priests among us probably know that we usually associate this reading with weddings, right? It's almost become to the point of cliche that whenever you go to a Catholic wedding, you can probably expect the second reading to be this one here. And yet when we actually read the first letter to the Corinthians in its fullness, we realize that the group that Paul is talking to is not a wedding at all. It's a very different kind of community. The Christian community in the Corinthians is a group that had failed to live up to its gospel mandate in so many ways. Immorality, division, abuse of the Eucharist, right? And the more I read this letter, the less I'm reminded of a wedding, and the more I'm reminded of a religious community. Now hear me out. When St. Paul gives the examples of the kinds of people who he's talking to, right? He's talking about, right, the gifts, the charisms, prophecy, tongues, etc. But let's listen closely. If I speak in human and angelic tongues, if I comprehend all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I give away everything and hand my body over, language, knowledge, and the vows. St. Paul is yelling at us 1,200 to 2,000 years into the future. He's telling us that there are a lot of things that we do in this life as Dominicans, as religious. We have a particular charism. A lot of us are pretty good at theology. A lot of us are pretty good at preaching. All other kinds of gifts. We do a lot of things, right? We make a lot of sacrifices. But that's not the point. Recently we've been reading from the Rule of St Augustine, one of the documents upon which our order was founded, and it's easy to sort of get pulled aside by some of the intricacies of laundry and the library and the public baths. But I think it's important for us to pull back to the very beginning of that rule. When Augustine says, the chief motivation for your sharing life together is to live harmoniously in the house and to have one heart and one mind. In other words, you live here so that you can love one another. In other words, all of the great homilies that we give, all of the 1,000-page dissertations that we write, all of those pale in comparison to the day in and day out living together with one another. And so when St. Paul begins his ode to this virtue of love, this virtue of charity, I think it's interesting that the very first description that he gives to love, he could have said lots of things, right? He could have said love is tender, love is self-sacrificial. He says love is patient. In other words, love is the ability to suffer things and people that we don't like very much. Many of us would probably say, and we probably will in a couple of weeks when we have the clemency, that the best part of Dominican life is community, and the worst part of Dominican life is community. And later on, in this letter, Paul speaks of a certain childishness that the Corinthians have, right? Because they're bogged down in the partial. They're bogged down in the partial truths of their community and have failed to live up to the fullness of the truth to which they are called. But I think there's something comforting in what St. Paul is saying. Because what St. Paul is pointing out is that the Corinthians are but spiritual children. And so it is for each of us. Even the most experienced among us, in the context of eternity, is but a spiritual infant. And I say that because when we adopt the posture that each of us is a spiritual infant among other spiritual infants, then that changes everything. It makes it a lot easier to be patient. It makes it a lot easier to love. It helps us to bear all things. It helps us to endure all things. Because we don't expect an infant to understand the intricacies of mathematics or of the English language, nor should we expect a spiritual infant to be perfect in every virtue. Instead, we grow together. St. Paul was a mystic. When the Corinthians were willing to settle for mediocrity, because that was all that they saw in themselves, he saw the possibility for grace. He knew that there was grace working in that community, and if they put their hearts to it, that they too could once again return to the path of eternity. And so, let us follow in the tradition of all those other great Dominican mystics, from Thomas to Catherine, down to our present day, Congar, Gergen. When the world sees sin, when the world sees sin, we can see something very different. Let's be mystics together.